Let me begin by immediately issuing a formal disclaimer. EU5 has currently adopted the Stellaris ideology of updates and reworks happening at insane rates. In some cases, literally daily patches, which do also include reworks and rebalances to military. This does naturally hinder my ability to do a comprehensive military guide, so I won't. But instead I will offer fine tips for winning battles, sieges, and hence wars instead. And as a final homage for those that make it through the entire video, a fun strategy that is insanely effective in the current EU5 military metagame, dare I say. So stick around for that. And I mean, you can skip to the end, but let's pretend you can't do that. That said though, before we do begin, let's get the usual things out of the way. A like would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing if you haven't already. Thank you everyone for the support recently. We have been doing really well on subs, so let's keep that momentum going. The very ambitious target of 100k remains ambitious, that's for sure, but certainly within sight. Finally, as always, if you are getting EU5 or anything else in the Paradox store, well, please do use code Lemon Cake. It does help support the channel, but that's certainly enough self-shitting. Let's get into the video proper. Tip number 1 is going to be quite general, but it's probably going to be the most useful tip out of everything. If you come away with one lesson from this video, it's going to be this one, and I'm going to tell you it right at the start because I do think this is the most important one. You are not playing a war game, you are playing a grand strategy game. And that means that not only is winning battles not the most important thing, it's about winning the war, you also have to bear in mind the cost of warfare from the point of view of continuing the war and its consequences. What I mean to say by that is that not every single war has to end with 100% war score victory for you. And in many cases, especially on nations like Byzantium, or frankly most countries actually, a lot of the time you're going to be better off suing for an earlier peace for less things than dragging out a war later to get that 100% war score. A lot of wars, let's be clear, involve raising your levies. Raising levies is pretty bad for your economy, decreasing raw material output by 20% and local food production by 20%, meaning as wars continue and your levies are not at home working the fields in the literal sense, there's a significant economic impact on your nation from doing that. Now, you can eventually afford that, but especially early on, where any kind of economy or any kind of money scaling you make early leads to outsized investment, as of course economic growth tends to be exponential, meaning that an extra 1% of growth early on multiplies multiple times throughout your campaign. Well, prolonged warfare decreasing that raw materials output and that local food production is going to hurt, and that's going to have a impact on your campaign throughout. Now, that doesn't mean wars can't be profitable, but that does mean that if you're dragging out a war for a couple extra years just to, dare I say, even avoid paying some extra war reps or giving up an old province or two, when you could peace out, go back to economic scaling, and come back stronger or at a more opportune time when your opponents are, shall we say, more distracted, well, just do that. To give an arbitrary example, and this is up to you to decide, if you are playing as Byzantium again, and you decide to do an early war against the Ottomans, great idea, and then Serbia or Bulgaria declare war on you, you could get distracted, find a prolonged two-side war and win both wars and 100% them. Or you could still focus on the Ottomans and let the Bulgarians and Serbians invade you for a while, making sure you get that win on the Ottomans and then turn around to deal with the Bulgarians or Serbians. Or even maybe going to the Serbians and giving up some of your land, giving them some provinces and even some money, just for them to leave you alone so you can focus on the Ottomans, and then coming back and, well, demolishing the Serbians later. In both of these scenarios, chances are that's going to be a cheaper option than actually fighting the Serbians or Bulgarians. You have to consider the cost of war versus the cost of peace. And from a purely practical point of view, half the time it's going to be pretty much better off just taking the early peace. The other thing to bear in mind is also going to be war exhaustion or war exhaustion decay. War exhaustion can be pretty brutal in this game. At 20 war exhaustion, it's also going to decrease your RGO and food output by minus 20%. This means that if you have raised levies and 20 war exhaustion, you're going to be having incredibly major downswings inside of your economy. They're going to become less prominent as your economy scales later on, and as you're able to afford it better, shall we say, when you have more money to work with. But especially in the early game, a lot of your money is going to be coming from peasant estates. Byzantium is a bad example because Byzantium doesn't have a lot of money coming in full stop. But nevertheless, later on you're going to be able to handle the impacts of warfare more. Early on, they're going to suck because of just how much of your economy is reliant on peasants working the fields and producing RGOs. Now, is it an easy guess to make? No. Sometimes you're going to gamble and make the wrong gamble. Sometimes you'd think, oh, I'm just going to fight a couple battles, force them back, and then they'll sue for a more favorable peace. And then you lose those battles, and you end up in the worst of both worlds. Now you have even less wars, and they're going to demand more things, right? But those are the gambles you have to make as a ruler. Those are the decisions you have to make. But my main point here, and this is something that a lot of people who play grand strategy games seem to not really understand, is that you don't have to ultimate victory or even win every single war you're in. It's fine to lose some land and come back and take it later. In fact, in a decent chunk of the time, it's going to be more optimal to lose some land and come back to it later within some of the harder starts. If you are playing, for example, France, there are very rarely situations where it makes sense for you to lose land to get someone out of a war. Sure, but again, in a situation like Byzantium, if you are killing the Ottomans early and you're having a pretty close fight and Bulgaria declares war on you, you're probably better off just giving some provinces and some money and coming back later. And again, just to really summarize, if you call it here, click off the video, this is the one message you take away today, I'm still going to be happy, right? You need to understand the price of war and understand that a non-trivial amount of time, the continuation of war is going to be more expensive than taking an earlier peace deal and just getting back to peace, getting back to your peasants' work in the fields, and getting back to economic and national build-up. After all, EU5 is certainly a marathon, not a sprint, and with a game taking, 500 odd years? Yeah, you're going to have plenty of times for more opportune wars later. But alright, let's move on to actual military advice. And the first of the actual I'm now fighting advice to make you win, that's going to be pick your terrain. Terrain was very important in EU4, and in EU5, dare I say, terrain is almost too important. Dice rolls in EU5 compared to EU4 have changed. If you're used to the EU4 dice roll mechanics, you would know that in battle you'd roll between a 0 and a 9, or for the D&D enjoyers out there, or probability enjoyers, or whatever you want to say, you'd roll a D10 minus 1, or for any not major nerds out there, okay, you're playing EU5, who are you kidding? You're rolling a 10-sided dice and taking 1 away from the final result, so you'll get anywhere between a 0 and a 10. However, the most usual dice that everyone's used to tends to be the D6 or the 6-sided dice, and that's what we use in EU5. You roll a 6-sided dice, meaning every time you roll for battle, you'd roll between a 1 and a 6, and that impacts the next 5 hours of the combat phase inside your, battle. So far, so good. But let's take a look at defensive terrain modifiers, and this is what I mean by picking your terrain. Two things matter for this case. We're going to look at both vegetation and topography, and immediately you want to be fighting on hills and mountains. Hills naturally come with a pretty brutal -1 dice roll, or attacker penalty on combat +1. What this means is that your D6 is already been reduced by 1, or you're getting a pretty impressive -17% average combat performance. And if I told you there was one modifier that made your troops 17% better, you'd go, whoa, that sounds pretty good. How can I make my enemy's troops 17% worse, or my own troops 17% better? And the answer is you want to be defending a hill. But it gets better, of course. We have mountains, much like in EU4. Mountains also give up -2, or in this case, attacker penalty in combat of +2. And this now represents a 34% difference in your combat ability. Of course, there's a lot more numbers and things going on, but this is a good way of understanding an impact of +2 on a D6 roll. It's a massive swing, right? And that would be pretty brutal, but it actually gets worse, because the best terrain to defend in this game is forested or wooded or jungle mountains. And as you can see, there are actually quite a few of these around. This is a mountain with +1, but this is also a forested mountain. There are a couple of these provinces in Albania, a couple over here next to Byzantium, and I mean, just keep an eye out for them. There's one in Italy over here, I do believe. Yes, this is another forested mountain. These make for the absolute best, the pinnacle for your actual defensive maneuverability, because that is a -3 on a d6 dice roll. That is, for all intents and purposes, a 50% reduction in enemy fighting ability. What's also important is defending forests and mountains is very much something that favors the weaker nation in an engagement. That does mean that if you are a very powerful nation, you want to steamroll your enemies, you're going to have a harder time doing so, because the way that your advantage is usually shown is through numerical superiority. However, with how the frontage system works, that is to say that if we take a look at a unit, we can see that we're able to use up to 10 frontage, basically using 10 combat widths of the amount of troops you can have in battle. Let's say that it was 1 guy to 1 frontage. It isn't. We'll be able to have 10 guys fighting. Well, on a mountain, in a forest, we are reducing these numbers quite severely, with both the forest reducing this by 3 and the mountain reducing this by 4, meaning that instead of having 10 guys, we now have 3 guys in the battle, and this naturally tends to favor smaller, higher army quality nations more than it tends to favor, shall we say, larger, more numbers-based armies. It's just harder to overwhelm when you have less troops in the battle. In practice, all this means is that they massively favor the mountain forest defender. It gets those somehow worse. See, one of the properties from forest, for example, is that it blocks visions from land and sea, meaning that you can literally park your army in the forest inside of the mountains and it would hide there. The enemy would not see that province even if they normally would have fog of war over it, and this works for the AI players as well. Will march into it and take very unfavorable fights. Terrain is disgustingly important for EU5, so much so that defending is basically a absolute dream for anyone involved, especially when you start going into reinforcement, and we'll get into that later. But yes, picking good fights in good terrain is extra critical, and this is even more so present because there's currently a bug in the game. This might be fixed, and I'm assuming it's a bug. I hope it's not a permanent feature. But one of the other ways you can get a -1 penalty is if we do locate a river. A bit hard to do. I think there's a river map mode somewhere. I know you have to activate it in some method. But either way, if you are taking a river crossing, you normally have a -1 penalty. But let's say that, for the sake of argument, there is a mountain fort here that is a forest mountain in this province. Actually, let's take a look at the Byzantium provinces because we'll actually have vision there. Right, let's take a look at this province here, which is a forest mountain, right? Imagine there's a river between Karditsa and Pile over here, right? And someone is sieging Pile. If there is a river between these two towers and you would cross the river into Pile, you would be the defender, assuming there's a fort on here, against the enemy. And if this was EU4, you would have a -3 because of the forest -1 and mountain -2. So far, so good. However, because you cross the river in EU5, you would actually give your opponents -4 because you are giving your opponents the river crossing penalty. It is a bit weird, but it's just really powerful because a -4 swing on a d6 dice roll is an absolutely ridiculous -67% combat ability for your enemies, which is stupid, and is something that's worth mentioning, right? It's just absolutely devastating to cross a river into a forest mountain and defend, right? But yes, that is the pinnacle of the defensive bonuses you can currently acquire, and hence worth mentioning. So, whether you're an attacker or defender, keep a close eye out for terrain. It really does matter, and again, I'd argue a bit too much. Ideally, as the attacker, you want to be fighting in plateaus and flatlands, and avoiding fighting in hills and mountains as much as possible, and the same can be said for the defender. Try and hide away in the mountains and hopefully catch people marching through said mountains or said hills, although I don't think you can hide in hills, to be clear. Oh no, I do apologize, you can absolutely hide in the hills as well. In fact, there's basically most places you can hide, I've just realized. You can hide in forests, you can hide in mountains, you can hide in hills. Can you hide in woods? You can only hide in woods from the sea. If you're on the land, you can see someone in the woods, but not in the forest. Finally, Paradox has actually answered the difference between a wood and a forest, because it's something they've even had as a distinction in EU4, but very much failed to elaborate, I do believe. But either way, the main point still very much stands. Vegetation and the terrain really matters, and this is an excellent way of greatly reducing the combat ability of your enemies. And I haven't even mentioned things like straight crossing. Those can be pretty brutal too. Pick your terrain, make sure you are constantly picking good fights. And this is one of the things I mean by picking good fights. If you are fighting the enemy, that even if they have more army quality than you, that you outnumber, and you're picking good terrain, you're probably still going to win, because unless they're running around with some kind of ridiculous over-the-top EU4 Prussian buffs where they formed Zoroastrian Prussia or something stupid like that, well, the reality of the situation is that defending a river-crossing forest mountain is a 67% swing in army quality, which is absolutely ridiculous. Should this be nerfed? Yeah, probably. In fact, I'll be in favor of nerfing it, but nevertheless, it's currently in the game, so something they should certainly be using if you want to win. But okay, we've talked about terrain, you've learned where to pick your battles, now let's talk about with what to pick your battles. You want to make sure you familiarize yourself with the Balance Unit Army button. You tend to end up pressing this a decent chunk of the time. In essence, this is going to spread out your units among 3 flanks, and I think this is a very important and very underrated thing you can do. And if you find yourself losing against the AI and you can't really tell why, I'm going to wager that you probably didn't press this button. It is genuinely as simple as that. The main thing to understand why it matters is that if you have everyone, say, inside of your left flank, well, a couple of forces are going to conspire against you. First of all, most infantry regiments have access to this beautiful modifier over here that is going to be called Secured Flanks. This modifier, as the tooltip will tell you, provides a defensive bonus when there are friendly troops in the neighboring section. And if both flanks are secure, aka you're standing in the middle and you have both flanks covered, this bonus is doubled. This is an absolutely ridiculous increase to your defense. In all practical sense, doubles or even triples your defense, assuming your flanks are secured. This doesn't just apply to regular armies. Certain levies also have access to the secured flanks ability on infantry. In fact, I'm going to say that unless you're fighting with peasant rebels, most units have access to the secured flank ability. And what this means in practice is that once your flanks start falling, you're going to actually see a pretty noticeable increase in the amount of damage you're going to start taking. And that hurt. This is further amplified by the fact that a decent chunk of units, especially cavalry, but even normal units, have something called flanking ability, which impacts how much damage they inflict on units in a different section in combat. That is to say, if they are at any point flanking. And you don't have to flank from the sides. If, for example, the enemy center breaks and their left and right flanks are standing, the central units are going to get the flanking bonuses when they're spreading to the left or right as well. So that is something to bear in mind. In essence, you want to make sure that all three of your flanks are holding when you're fighting, and if they're starting to break, you better have a very good reason as to why you're not retreating from the battle, because it's going to be a very expensive battle from both a troop perspective and morale perspective for you to remain in. As you may guess, cavalry, however, is immune, or basically does not have access to the secured flanks modifier, meaning it is a pretty nice unit to have on the flanks, especially when you consider that it has 200% flanking ability on most of the units, and some have even higher stats. It really depends with what you're fighting. But as a general rule, cavalry tends to be quite good on the flanks. Now, as I've been playing the game, one of the things I've realized is I think the AI tends to overweigh its application to both its right flank and central flank. So, if you are fighting, shall we say, an enemy that is weaker than you, I'd actually suggest you also overpower them on both the right and central flanks. You meet them where they are meeting you, and because you are in general stronger, you should be able to, not get outmaneuvered. The thinking is that if you're stronger than your enemy, you want to make sure there's no shenanigans that happen, and you just consistently get there, grind them down, and get you the win, right? That's the plan if you are the stronger person in the engagement. If you are the weaker person, if there's no shenanigans, you just lose, so you have to rely on random shenanigans or other little tactics that you can employ. And one of these tactics is actually going to be very much overpowering your own left flank in the battle. If you are playing on the defensive on side your right flank and middle flanks and have your cavalry on the left flank, because the AI as a general rule tends to underfill the left flank, I find. I'm not sure how consistent this is, but it's just something I've observed at the moment. Usually the left flank is the first flank that breaks in a perfectly distributed army on my end. Well, trying to make a play for breaking the left flank and then inflicting some disproportional casualties based on that, I think is a pretty decent approach to playing the game. Now, this might get changed later, but I actually think this is a reflection of a historical trend where the right flank was the most prestigious flank, and at least that's what I've been told. This could actually be a paradox, genuine coding representation of the importance of the right flank of the army. Either way, in general, I'd recommend you always make sure that your flanks are distributed as equally as possible. You never want to be flanked, and you ideally have your infantry in the middle so they can min-max their secured flank modifiers, and you have your cavalry on the flank so if they do break the enemy, they can get the maximum flanking bonuses in. And as stupid as that sounds, that really is about it for army composition, especially when you're fighting in the early game. You're mainly working with the levies that you have access to. And sure, there are things you can do to modify the levies you have access to. Certain privileges like Auxilium et Concilium do give you access to more nobility levy size, and if you over-urbanize early, you're going to have access to more burgher levies compared to peasant levies. And if you de-urbanize, you can actually convert your burgher levies into peasant levies if you ever want to do that for some reason. That said, there actually aren't, again, that many things you can do to change your army levy composition, so you are for the most part working with what you have. So yeah, make sure you basically press this button, and if you're doing any micro for army composition, have your cavalry on the left or right flanks. Otherwise, just take good fights, and as long as you're distributing your armies, you should be fine. But okay, you're picking your terrain, you've distributed your armies, you're protecting your center, you're having your cavalry crush the flanks and are doing well on that front. However, one of the themes explored within EU5 is the progression from a levy-based army to a more professional standing army. And one of the liberties that you gain with your standing army is the ability to actually customize the units you're working with. So, when you are building up around your army, what kind of army composition or what kind of units should you be recruiting? Well, for that, we need to very quickly do a TLDR history lesson on the concept of pike and shot warfare. It tends to begin after professional armies and is actually the name of an institution as well. But to really simplify, and I do mean I'm really simplifying here, there are hour-long video essays on YouTube that you should watch if you're more interested in the historical applications and developments of pike and shot warfare. But basically, the idea behind pike and shot is, how do we defend against an enemy cavalry charge? I know. We bring pikemen, so that the horsey go on the pointy stick and die. And then how do we kill our enemies? Well, you see, we take a gun, and we shoot, and the enemy turn to dust. Excellent innovation. But we have this problem, right? If we bring everyone with gun to shoot at the enemy, if they have a lot of cavalry, they're going to charge into us, break our handgunner formations, and we're going to be sad because we're going to be dead. And if we bring loads of pikemen to defend against cavalry charges, our enemies are going to bring a lot of a gun, and also make us sad because they're going to shoot us out of existence. And so we've reached the peak military innovation. What if we do gun and spike? Genius. The spikes protect from the funny horse people, and the gun make the enemies go away from range. This is a flawless military tactic, and unironically this actually worked. Like, I'm not kidding, this is the baseline, very quick TLDR simplified for 5-year-olds version of pike and shot warfare, right? The thing you have to understand is why pike and shot warfare works. Is because it came up against other well-balanced armies consisting of pike, shot, cavalry, and other things to counter. Let's imagine that your opponent does not have cavalry. You're not playing against the Mamluks, which tend to have the Mamluk cavalry. You're not fighting the French, which tend to have a lot of their French knights. You are fighting against some Italian city-states. They don't have a lot of cavalry. They have mostly infantry. You could bring pike and shot, or, because you know you're not fighting a lot of cavalry, you can disregard the pikemen, which do better at counting cavalry, and just bring shot. You're going to be able to hard counter a lot of other infantry this way, and indeed a pure pike and shot army with no cavalry will actually eventually lose out to a pure shot army because they're going to have more firepower. And at the same time, though, that pure shot army is going to lose out to a cavalry army that can rush them down. And so there's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors meeting here, but it does mean that if you know your enemy, so you know that you're fighting the Mamluks as Byzantium, eventually, for example, bringing more pike is a good idea, and if you're fighting the Italians, bringing more shot is a good idea, so it's a case of knowing your enemy. Now, the enemy is also going to learn about you. In the Italian cases, it's a bit hard for them to invest in a lot of cavalry out from the void, but they can, so it's something to bear in mind. The enemy will counter you. And the same for the Mamluks. The Mamluks, if they were a player in a player environment, would know that, okay, they have their excellent Mamluk levies, but because of that, and they know that you're going to bring a lot of pikes, they should invest into a more shot-based system to counter that. It's something that you do have to bear in mind, but this is one of the more meta approaches to army composition. And while it is true that somewhat specialized forces can beat other specialized forces, bringing in a diverse army of pike and shot with cavalry to punish purely shot-based armies isn't ever going to be the perfect counter, but it's never going to be wrong. So if you're in a position by the 1537, 1600s, when this institution comes and you can actually start building a more specialized army, though to be fair, you can do this from the 1437 professional armies as well, I'd recommend, if you are in a position of strength, like that of France, to just build a well-rounded army. Because again, if you're in a position of strength and you are one of the stronger nations, you don't need to pull shenanigans, you need to avoid shenanigans. And having a well-balanced army of cavalry, infantry, and gun infantry, as well as pike infantry, you're going to be minimizing hard counters to your build. At the same time, if you are someone like the Italian city-states invaded by the French and you see that they've really gone into cavalry, might be a good idea to double down on pikes. And if you're seeing a massive resurgent Byzantium being played by a player and they're trying to invade you with a lot of their Varangian Guard infantry, might be a good idea to invest into shot to counter. So in essence, know your enemy and be aware of the pike, shot, and cavalry dynamics. Artillery does also get involved in this equation later. I think around from 1637, ironically the artillery innovation, is when artillery starts becoming not cosmetic in combat, and my advice is from that point is, yeah, you just want it. If you are fighting and want continuous fighting, not only is it useful for sieges, there are very few cases where you have too much artillery, if that's even possible. So okay, you've picked your terrain, you've protected your center, you are winning on the flanks, you've mastered pike and shot warfare. My final bit of advice is going to be how to go on the offensive in EU5 and not be punished too much for it. A lot of things are really rigged for the defender in EU5. It is fundamentally a very pro-defender game. As mentioned, the defensive terrain modifiers are pretty brutal, the ability to hide in forests and mountains is pretty brutal. In essence, if you are ever going on the offensive, you want to make sure you have either overwhelming numbers or overwhelming quality, or frankly, both. It is hard to go on the offensive here and not get punished for it. This is even further amplified that if you are going on the offensive with levies, they're not going to be recovering after they're raised in your land or the enemy land as well. The only way to recover them is to disband and reform, and of course your levies are coming from their homeland, meaning that the nation on the defensive is going to have their levies reform faster than someone on the offensive. This dynamic does change slightly with professional armies, but it actually changes in a way that favors the defender even more. What I mean to say by that is that your professional armies recover disproportionately quickly compared to EU4 inside of your home land, and they don't recover abroad. So let's say you're on campaign, you are the Ottomans, and you're trying to siege Constantinople. Well, the Byzantine armies, if they're sitting in this tile, are going to be able to, the professional ones, recover their manpower from their manpower pools. you are not going to have that luxury. You're going to have to drop back to your own land and recover. This means that military campaigns ideally are conducted against people that are like 1 or 2 or 3 tiles away from your homeland, as you're able to take battles, pop back, recover, and not go into any prolonged military, shall we say, excursions. Those excursions are still possible, but they get dangerous. Enemies will be able to take fights against you, and even if they lose, they will decrease your strength, and they'll be able to then retreat, recover their strength, and come back into the fight. This is important to understand from the perspective that sieges and any kind of offensive actions are hence kind of dangerous, and should only be done when you are already in a winning position. The other thing that I think is important to now talk about is going to be fort assaulting. Now, this is a bit of a weird topic because it's one of the mechanics that Paradox has rebalanced for EU5 like every 5 goddamn minutes, let's be honest. In the current version, if you're assaulting with levies, you may as well be pressing the disband levies button because it just deletes your levies and very rarely achieves any kind of success. I would say that to assault with levies, let's say you are France and you're trying to assault this fort over here, you're going to be paying around 10k levies and you're going to have to do 2 assaults on a 20k levy stack to be able to actually win that siege. Is it worthwhile? Sure, sometimes it certainly is, but it's a very expensive price to pay, especially when you're considering that you are losing your own pops, your own taxpayers, and your potential pops with potential pop growth as well once you do that. However, this script completely changes once you have infantry standing armies. Like 10k regulars of infantry is basically the ability to win every single assault for free forever, and I do mean with like trivial casualties, like you will lose 2-3 infantry. It is genuinely just a free win fort button. It's frankly pretty ridiculous. It's a hard thing to balance. Again, you want to have the assault button will work sometimes and be expensive, but at the moment it either does absolutely nothing and assaulting is always pointless, or the assault button is a free win on every single siege. So we'll see what Paradox ends up doing with it eventually, but I'm just talking about the current version of EU5 at the time of recording. That said, early assaults and fighting next to your land is still something that applies, because yes, you may not take any attrition or quote-unquote losses from assaulting, but let's say I have my armies to Constantinople, I march down to across the strait here, I go and take Izmit by an assault, and then I march 1 tile down, and then I take a fight in Iznik. And I'll take some casualties from the fight, let's say I even win. I could continue down to Bursa and keep assaulting, but I've now taken casualties. And if this was a longer campaign, let's say I was campaigning from France, obviously I'd have a harder time to return home and recover those casualties. But as Byzantium, it makes a lot of sense to pop back to your home territory over here, because it's just 2 tiles away, you can pop back, recover, and then continue on your own campaign. In essence, meaning that the previous advice of still ideally going on the offensive next to your own home territory you can resupply from very much still stands, and the defender is still favored because you are still taking defensive fights on forts. It's just at the moment, sieges specifically from offensive actions are very, dare I say, weighted to make professional armies the win every single siege button. So make of that what you will. But alright, that concludes my main 5 points, my 5 military tips to win wars in EU5. But I promised you earlier in this introduction how did I phrase it? Military metagame, dare I say. There we go, that was how I phrased it, in terms of winning wars in a funny way. And for that, we need to discuss how cannons actually work for battles, right? Once you are around the 1637 and artillery starts becoming actually good for battles, especially stronger than military revolutions, and by the final institutions, the levy en masse, within the Age of Revolutions, you're going to discover the flying battery unit, which is incredible for the tactic I'm about to describe. Where is the thing? There it is, the flying battery. Now, I know, it's a late game EU5, haha, no one plays this far. But hear me out. The way that artillery works in battles is that when you go into a battle, you have a barrage phase, right? For the first 5 hours of the fight, the artillery moves forward, it gets a free shot off at the enemy, and continues getting free shots for the first 5 hours, and then the battle actually starts. What this means is that early game, when artillery is practically cosmetic, every single battle takes 5 hours longer than it has to, because you walk in, the cosmetic cannons do a bit of a fireworks show, then they retreat, and then you have the actual battle. Fine. However, from the Age of Reformation onwards, and the advent of the siege artillery innovations, artillery stops being cosmetic in battles. The second statement that we have to factor in is the fact that, at the moment, you are allowed to retreat from the battle whenever you want. Which is a bit stupid. Paradox should change this, but the reality of the situation is that if you go into a battle and you don't like how the battle is going, you can just leave. The enemy can't legally stop you leaving the battle. Of course, you will eventually run out of land. If you're on the defensive, you will run out of places to retreat to, so on and so forth. But if you want to leave the battle, you just can. And so with that, I'm going to introduce to you what I would like to say is somewhat peak Napoleonic warfare, or even some kind of modern warfare military tactic. But it does just really work, and it's really funny, and frankly is a bit too broken. And that is the artillery-only flying battery armies, right? So what you do is you spam artillery-only flying batteries. Just have like 100,000 of these guns, right? Then you arrive at the battle against the enemy. You march into the battle. Your artillery goes into the front phase. It does its 5 hours of bombarding, absolutely obliterating the enemy. However, after that's over, well, after those 5 hours, the battle's meant to start properly. The enemy will be able to actually fight back. If they had their own artillery, sure, they can shoot back in the first phase, but their infantry and cavalry just kind of have to sit there looking pretty while they're getting shot. But alright, 5 hours have passed. Their infantry and their cavalry arrive at the battle. They're finally starting to, get revenge. They're going to be able to punch back. They're going to be able to actually kill your artillery, at which point you order the retreat, because you can't just do that. So you drop back a tile, and the battle's over. In essence, giving you a free bombard phase, greatly diminishing enemy armies, at minimal cost to yourself, because any conventional army composition isn't going to be pure artillery, so you're going to be able to outgun them in the first 5 hour phase. And then what happens? Well, if they chase you down, you start a new battle. That is to say, you start a new 5 hour artillery phase. So you get another round of free shots off, and then you can retreat. This is really stupid. This is really powerful. It's fundamentally really broken, but basically artillery only is kind of the endgame meta with the current retreat system. You just want to spam these guys, arrive at the battle, do a 5 hour volley, and just leave. That is it. That is the current military meta for late game EU5. Is that a fun campaign? I think it's a fun campaign at least once, and I'd recommend you doing it before they eventually patch this by making retreats not free. But yes, this is the funny EU5 military metagame that I was alluding to earlier. I hope you enjoy. But with that said, that is unfortunately all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Lemon, Lozendica, Nikas, Nanhatan, Star72, Wilson Rabbit, Besser Gaming, Gramo Flavia, Lebarule, W Haste, Sov, Anthony35, AC Napo, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Danray, Malvi, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Zentronic, Twoinit, and Aquabird.